All right, actually, before we start the questions, I'm going to leave a thought from Chairman Mao, which again I think really embodies the Cultural Revolution. I had it right here. Okay, here we go. In opposition to subjectivism, sectarianism, and stereotyped party writing, we must have in mind two purposes. First, learn from past mistakes to avoid future ones, and second, cure the sickness to save the patient. The mistake of the past was to be exposed. The mistakes of the past must be exposed without sparing anyone's sensibilities. It is necessary to analyze and criticize what was bad in the past with a scientific attitude, so that the work in the future will be done more carefully and done better. This is what is meant by learn from past mistakes to avoid future ones. But our aim in exposing errors and criticizing shortcomings, like that of a doctor curing a sickness, is solely to save the patient and not to doctor him to death. A person with appendicitis is saved when the surgeon removes his appendix. So long as a person who has made mistakes does not hide his sickness for fear of treatment, or persist in his mistakes until he is beyond cure, so long as he is honestly and sincerely wishes to be cured and to mend his ways, we should welcome him and cure his sickness so that he can become a good comrade. We can never succeed if we just let ourselves go and lash out at him. In treating an ideological or political malady, one must never be rough and rash, but must adopt the approach of curing the sickness to save the patient, which is the only correct and effective method. So, with that, I am now welcoming any criticism or self-criticism. Sorry, you have a question.
No, you see, I thought I was going to put it into a question, but I'm just fascinated by the whole Great Link. I think that's absolutely fascinating. So,
yeah.
Would you like to talk more about that? Maybe talk more about the comparison with the hippie movement?
Yeah. The hippie movement sucked, and the Great Link Up was awesome. But let me kind of get a little bit of a background about that. Because China was a classed society, well, we have the same thing in here, in our society, right? If you're born to rich parents, society gives you a bonus, right? It's called inheritance, or cash, or them paying for your college, or a car, or whatever you want to name it, right? Our society rewards people who are born to rich parents. Well, the problem is, how do you deal with this in a transition to socialism? So there was a good way to do that, or it was a way to do that. It was all right. What would happen is people were characterized by their class history. Where did you come from? Who were your parents? What did they do? What did their parents do? Do you own lots of property? Did they own lots of property? What did they do with that property? Etc., etc. So a lot of students actually came from very rich parents, relatively rich parents, I guess, rich peasants, rich city dwellers. And so they were actually not privileged in regards to a position. When it came time to apply for college, the thinking was, look, you guys have had several thousand years of being the rich elites. Our emphasis is going to be on training factory workers and training peasants, in education. So if you were of any of these proletarian backgrounds, you had a much better job, or chance of getting a job, or chance of getting into education, or etc., etc. Well, the Great Link Up actually really tread on this sort of thread. Anyone could become a Red Guard, and pretty much anyone did. And so a lot of people left behind their class backgrounds to actually experience what the proletariat, what the peasants actually experience. And so rather than just a flight from alienation of one's position, which I think was the heavy core of the Western hippie movement, or the Western counterculture, was one of alienation. So it was above all a negative movement, right? I'm sick of your industrialized society that's polluting me, and your war, and your Vietnam, and your draft card, and your sexism, and your racism. So I'm going to flee from that, into naturalism, into radical sexualities, into whatever you want to name. For the Great Link Up, yeah, for some of the upper class students, they were leaving their class behind them. But it was more about understanding and experiencing the working class as the working class. And so it was about linking up with people, traveling together wherever you were going, or traveling for a time, splitting up, sharing your food, sharing your house, sharing transportation, sharing your stories about what you've seen, what you've experienced, what you think about the revolution. And so that was really much more of the focus, rather than a negative flee from alienation, flee from oppression. And so that was sort of the impulse of the Great Link Up.
Thank you.
No problem. Questions?
I was wondering about the relation with Tibet to the Cultural Revolution. From my understanding, I think that the whole dispute of China claiming Tibet as their property happened, was it in the 50s?
Yeah.
And how did that relate to the People's Republic?
Well, actually, there's a really good article on this. I'm kind of embarrassed to say the source because it reveals my ultra-leftism. But actually, if you go on to the Cosima Project, they have a 5-part essay that specifically essay series that deals specifically with Tibet and the liberation of Tibet. Now, you have to keep in mind, China has been gaining and losing property or area for thousands of years. Even the most recent Chinese imperial dynasties, the Mandarins, or the Manchukuo, were relatively new phenomena, and they were not originally considered part of China. The core ethnic group of China is the Han Chinese, and there were a lot of different groups. On the west side, you had the Muslims, known as the Uyghurs. On the north, you had I think they're called the Kirghiz. You have ethnic Mongolians. In the south, you even have some ethnic Vietnamese, and you have some ethnic Koreans elsewhere. Tibet is one of those things that had been in and out of various, not possessions, but affiliations with China. Well, one thing you have to keep in mind, and the Cultural Revolution hit Tibet, but not as deeply as it hit the core of China, Shanghai, Beijing, those sorts of areas. One thing to keep in mind is that basically, no one really knows the condition of Tibet before the Chinese invasion. Now, to sort of talk a little bit about the condition of Tibet before the Chinese invasion, it had a religious leader, which was the Lama. And the way that this was structured is, depending on how high you were in the religious order, depended on how much food you got. And so the monks and the nuns were basically run everything. They would work peasants to death, they would beat them to death, and they would all do it because, here's the thing, man, if you were a good person, you would have been born a nun or a monk. You did something bad in your past life, and that justifies you feeding us, because we're enlightened, you're not. And if you keep your mouth shut and do a good job, next time you'll be born as one of us. Well, what happened is the PLA actually invaded Tibet to liberate it, and they did so in their traditional fashion, which was, if you were, it basically went like this. If you were working class and not an elite, you would be set free, unless you carried out horrible atrocities. And so this is what happened. They invaded Tibet. There was already Tibetan Maoists at this point, Tibetan communists who were sick of the monarchy, who aided in them rising up and helped establish the provisional government. But you get stories like, for example, one Tibetan who actually became a fan of the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese was a Tibetan, and he had a sword, and he's like, I don't understand it. I've chopped off the head of 6 of the PLA guys. They captured me. They disarmed me. And they gave me money and sent me home. And so, again, this was a war primarily directed at the elites, most specifically the religious elites, who were living in absolutely palatial conditions, especially relative to the serfs, the people bound to the land. So what happens is the PLA comes in, it throws out the feudalist, religious body. To be fair, they were initially offered a place in Tibet. And the only condition that they had to have is they didn't advocate the overthrow of the government. But you have to keep in mind, the Dalai Lama, for most of history has not simply been a spiritual leader. It's very much like the Pope. The Pope historically has not simply been a spiritual leader. It has also been a secular political leader. And so people close to the Dalai Lama led uprising after uprising. They were basically like, hey, guess what? You're not allowed here anymore. We're outlawing this because you're constantly calling for the overthrow of the government. He fled to India. During the Cultural Revolution, there were Red Guards. They did smash some stuff, but it was not a core area of intense focus. And so Tibet basically was passed over mostly. And so yeah, that's them in the Cultural Revolution.